Imagine a world where writing doesn't exist. No books, no records, no history. Now imagine being the first person to invent it. 5,000 years ago, in a land between two rivers, this actually happened. But here's what will shock you. This civilization was so advanced, it had cities with tens of thousands of people, complex governments, and revolutionary technologies, all before the pyramids of Egypt were even a dream. This is Sumer, the world's first civilization. And what you're about to discover will change how you see human history forever. Because everything you know about civilization, cities, writing, laws, government, it all started here. In the next 25 minutes, you'll witness the most important transformation in human history. How humans went from nomadic hunter-gatherers to building the first cities, inventing writing, and creating a way of life that would shape the world for the next 5,000 years. But first, we need to understand something that will blow your mind. Sumer didn't just appear out of nowhere. An entire revolution had to happen first. A revolution so profound, it changed everything about being human. Stay with us, because what you're about to learn is the foundation of everything. 5,000 years ago, in a land between two great rivers, something unprecedented happened. For the first time in human history, people came together not just to survive, but to build something that had never existed before: civilization itself. This is the story of Sumer, the world's first civilization, a place so ancient that when the pyramids of Egypt were being built, Sumer had already been a thriving urban society for over 1,000 years. But to understand how Sumer came to be, we must journey back even further, to a time when humans were just beginning to settle down, to a moment when everything changed. This is the story of how humanity took its first steps toward the modern world, how a group of people in the fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia transformed from nomadic hunter-gatherers into the builders of the world's first cities, the inventors of writing, and the creators of a way of life that would shape human history forever. The story begins not with Sumer itself, but with the revolutionary changes that made Sumer possible. The Neolithic Revolution, the greatest transformation in human history before the Industrial Revolution. It is a story of innovation and adaptation, of humans learning to control their environment in ways that had never been imagined, and, in doing so, setting the stage for everything that would follow. For 99% of human history, our ancestors lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving from place to place in small bands of 20 to 50 people, following the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the ripening of wild plants. Life was hard, but it was the only way of life humans had known for over 2 million years. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to happen. In multiple places around the world, the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys of China, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, humans independently began to experiment with something revolutionary: agriculture. Instead of simply gathering wild grains, they began to plant seeds. Instead of following herds, they began to domesticate animals. This was not a sudden change. It took thousands of years, but its consequences were profound. For the first time, humans could produce more food than they immediately needed. They could store surpluses for lean times. They could support larger populations. Most importantly, they could stay in one place. This shift from hunting and gathering to farming and herding is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it changed everything. It allowed humans to settle in permanent villages. It led to population growth. It created the need for new social structures to manage larger groups. It freed some people from the constant search for food, allowing them to specialize in other tasks, making tools, building structures, creating art, developing new technologies. The Neolithic Revolution was the foundation upon which all civilizations would be built, and nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the Fertile Crescent, the arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and the Levant to the Nile Valley. The Fertile Crescent earned its name for good reason. This region, shaped like a crescent moon, stretches from the Persian Gulf in the east, curves through the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, ancient Mesopotamia, continues through the Levant along the Mediterranean coast, and ends in the Nile Valley of Egypt. It was here that some of the world's most important crops were first domesticated: wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and flax. The climate was ideal, not too hot, not too cold, with reliable rainfall in the winter and spring. The soil, enriched by the annual flooding of the great rivers, was incredibly fertile. But it was the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that would prove most crucial for the development of Sumerian civilization. These two great rivers, flowing from the mountains of Anatolia and Iran, brought not just water, but life itself to the arid plains of southern Mesopotamia. Every spring, as snow melted in the distant mountains, the rivers would flood, depositing rich silt across the floodplains. This annual gift of nature created some of the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. However, the rivers were also unpredictable. Floods could be devastating, destroying crops and settlements. Droughts could be equally catastrophic. To truly harness the power of these rivers, humans would need to develop new technologies: irrigation systems to bring water to fields during dry periods, drainage systems to prevent flooding, and eventually, the social organization necessary to build and maintain these complex water management systems. It was this challenge, this need to work together to control the rivers, that would push the people of Mesopotamia toward the creation of civilization itself. By 7000 BC, the first permanent villages were appearing in Mesopotamia. These were not yet cities, they were small agricultural communities, typically housing a few hundred people at most. But they represented a fundamental shift in human society. At sites like Yarmo in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, archaeologists have found evidence of rectangular mud brick houses, storage pits for grain, and the bones of domesticated animals, sheep, goats, and later, cattle and pigs. The people of these early villages grew wheat and barley, made pottery for storing food and water, and crafted tools from stone, bone, and eventually, copper. Life was still hard. Disease, famine, and conflict were constant threats. But it was more stable than the nomadic existence that had come before. These early villages were largely self-sufficient, but they were not isolated. Trade networks began to develop, as different regions had access to different resources: obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Persian Gulf, copper from the mountains. These valuable materials began to flow along trade routes that would eventually connect distant regions. Most importantly, these early villages were laboratories for social innovation. As populations grew, new ways of organizing society had to be developed. Who would make decisions? How would disputes be resolved? How would resources be distributed? These questions, which had been simple matters in small nomadic bands, became complex problems requiring new solutions. The answers that emerged in these early villages would become the foundation for the more complex societies that would follow. The transition from simple villages to complex agricultural societies required more than just growing crops. It demanded new technologies, new ways of organizing labor, and most critically, new ways of managing water. In southern Mesopotamia, where Sumer would eventually emerge, the challenge was particularly acute. The land was flat, the rivers were powerful, and the climate was hot and dry for much of the year. To grow crops successfully, farmers needed to bring water to their fields during the dry season and protect their fields from devastating floods during the wet season. This required irrigation, the artificial application of water to land. Early irrigation systems were simple, ditches dug to channel water from rivers to fields. But as populations grew and more land was brought under cultivation, these systems became more complex. Canals had to be dug, maintained, and managed. Water had to be distributed fairly among different farmers. Disputes over water rights had to be resolved. This complexity required coordination, planning, and leadership. Someone had to organize the labor to dig the canals. Someone had to make decisions about where water would go. Someone had to resolve conflicts. This need for coordination and management was one of the key factors that pushed Mesopotamian society toward greater complexity. It created roles for leaders, administrators, and eventually the specialized class of people who would become the first rulers and priests. The management of water was not just a technical challenge, it was a social and political challenge that would shape the development of Sumerian civilization in fundamental ways. Around 5500 BC, a new cultural period began in Mesopotamia that archaeologists call the Ubaid period, named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid, where it was first identified. This period, which lasted until about 4000 BC, represents a crucial stage in the development towards civilization. During the Ubaid period, villages grew larger and more complex. Populations increased, reaching into the thousands in some settlements. Architecture became more sophisticated, with larger, multi-room houses and the first appearance of public buildings, structures that served the community as a whole rather than individual families. The most significant of these public buildings were temples, which began to appear on raised platforms. These early temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of economic activity, storing surplus grain, managing trade, and coordinating community projects like irrigation. The Ubaid period also saw significant technological advances. Pottery became more refined and standardized, suggesting specialized craftspeople. Tools became more sophisticated. Trade networks expanded, bringing materials from greater distances. But perhaps most importantly, the Ubaid period saw the development of more complex social organization. As communities grew larger, simple consensus-based decision-making became impractical. Leadership roles became more formalized. Specialization increased. Not everyone needed to be a farmer. Some people could focus on crafts, others on trade, others on religious or administrative duties. This division of labor, this specialization, was another crucial step towards civilization. The Ubaid period laid the groundwork for everything that would follow in Sumer. The irrigation systems that developed during the Ubaid period were engineering marvels for their time. What began as simple ditches evolved into complex networks of canals, some extending for miles. These canals brought life-giving water to fields that would otherwise have been barren desert. They allowed farmers to grow crops year-round, not just during the brief rainy season. They enabled the cultivation of new crops that required more water, increasing both the variety and quantity of food available. But building and maintaining these irrigation systems required enormous amounts of coordinated labor. A single canal might require hundreds of people working together for weeks or months. The work was backbreaking, digging through hard soil with simple tools, moving massive amounts of earth, shaping the channels to ensure proper water flow. Once built, the canals required constant maintenance. Silt would accumulate, requiring regular dredging. Banks would erode, requiring reinforcement. The system had to be expanded as populations grew and more land was brought under cultivation. This need for large-scale coordinated labor created new social structures. It required leaders who could organize and direct the work. It required systems for allocating labor and resources. It required ways of resolving disputes over water rights and maintenance responsibilities. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia were not just agricultural infrastructure. They were social infrastructure, creating the organizational patterns and leadership structures that would become the foundation of Sumerian city-states. They demonstrated that humans, working together in coordinated ways, could transform their environment on a scale never before attempted. As Ubaid period communities grew larger and more complex, new forms of social organization emerged. In small villages, everyone knew everyone else, and decisions could be made through informal discussion and consensus. But as populations reached into the thousands, this became impossible. New structures were needed. Leadership became more formalized. Some individuals, perhaps those who were particularly skilled at organizing irrigation projects or resolving disputes, began to take on more permanent leadership roles. These early leaders were not yet kings. They were more like headmen or chiefs, but they represented a step toward more hierarchical social organization. At the same time, the role of temples and priests became more important. Temples served as centers for storing surplus grain, managing trade, and coordinating community activities. Priests, who were often the most educated members of society, took on administrative roles. They kept track of resources, managed distribution, and made decisions about community projects. This combination of secular and religious leadership created a dual authority structure that would become characteristic of Sumerian society. Social stratification also began to develop more clearly. Not everyone had the same status or access to resources. Those who controlled land, managed trade, or held religious or administrative positions had more wealth and influence. This inequality, while creating tensions, also provided incentives for people to work within the system, to seek advancement, and to contribute to the community's success. The social organization that emerged during the Ubaid period was more complex, more hierarchical, and more capable of managing large-scale projects than anything that had come before. Trade was another crucial factor in the development towards civilization. During the Ubaid period, trade networks expanded dramatically, connecting distant regions and bringing new materials, ideas, and technologies to Mesopotamia. Obsidian from Anatolia, used for making sharp tools and weapons, flowed south along trade routes. Copper from the mountains of Iran and Anatolia began to appear, marking the beginning of the Chalcolithic or Copper Age. Shells from the Persian Gulf, used for jewelry and decoration, found their way to inland settlements. Semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and turquoise from the Sinai were traded over vast distances. This trade was not just about luxury goods, it was about essential resources. Mesopotamia, rich in agricultural products, lacked many raw materials. Stone for tools, metals for weapons and tools, timber for construction, all had to be imported. In exchange, Mesopotamian communities exported agricultural surpluses, textiles, and eventually, manufactured goods. Trade required organization. It needed people who could travel, negotiate, and manage transactions. It needed systems for measuring and valuing goods. It needed ways of recording transactions and tracking debts. Most importantly, trade brought people into contact with different cultures, different ideas, and different ways of doing things. This exchange of ideas was as important as the exchange of goods. It accelerated innovation, spread new technologies, and created the cultural connections that would eventually link the entire region into a shared civilization. The trade networks of the Ubaid period were the arteries through which the lifeblood of civilization would flow. The temples that began to appear during the Ubaid period were more than just places of worship. They were the first truly public buildings, structures that served the entire community. These early temples were built on raised platforms, making them visible from throughout the settlement and symbolizing their importance. They were larger and more elaborate than ordinary houses, constructed with better materials and more skilled craftsmanship. Inside, they served multiple functions. They were places of religious ritual, where priests conducted ceremonies to honor the gods and seek their favor. They were storage facilities, holding surplus grain and other goods that could be distributed in times of need or used for community projects. They were administrative centers, where records were kept, decisions were made, and community affairs were managed. They were economic hubs, managing trade, coordinating craft production, and distributing resources. The construction of these temples required significant resources and coordinated effort. Building a temple platform, constructing the temple itself, decorating it with art and religious symbols, all of this required planning, organization, and the ability to mobilize and direct labor. The temples became symbols of community identity and unity. They demonstrated that the community could undertake large-scale projects. They provided a focal point for community life, and they created roles for specialized individuals, priests, administrators, craftspeople, who served the temple, and through it, the entire community. The temples of the Ubaid period were prototypes for the great ziggurats that would later dominate Sumerian cities. They represented a new scale of human achievement, and a new level of social organization. By 4500 BC, Ubaid period communities were experiencing rapid population growth. The combination of reliable agriculture, improved irrigation, and better food storage meant that more children survived to adulthood, and adults lived longer. Populations that had numbered in the hundreds were now reaching into the thousands. Some of the largest settlements may have had populations of 5,000 or more. This population growth created both opportunities and challenges. More people meant more labor available for large-scale projects. It meant larger markets for trade. It meant more diverse skills and knowledge within the community. But it also meant greater pressure on resources. More land had to be brought under cultivation. Irrigation systems had to be expanded. More food had to be produced, stored, and distributed. Social organization had to become more complex to manage larger populations. Disputes became more common as more people competed for resources and status. Defense became more important as larger, wealthier settlements became attractive targets for raiders. This period of rapid growth was a crucible that tested the social and organizational systems that had developed during the Ubaid period. Communities that could successfully manage this growth would thrive and continue to develop toward true civilization. Those that could not would face crisis, conflict, and possibly collapse. The pressure was building, and something had to give. The stage was set for the next great leap forward, the emergence of the first true city. The increasing complexity of Ubaid period society led to greater specialization of labor. In small villages, most people had to be generalists. They farmed, made their own tools, built their own houses, and performed most tasks themselves. But as communities grew larger and more complex, this became inefficient. Some people were better at certain tasks than others. Some tasks required specialized knowledge or skills that took time to develop. Specialization made sense. Farmers could focus on growing food, producing more and better crops than if everyone farmed part-time. Craftspeople could develop expertise in pottery, weaving, metalworking, or tool-making, creating higher quality products. Traders could learn the routes, languages, and customs needed for successful commerce. Administrators and priests could focus on managing resources, keeping records, and coordinating community activities. This specialization increased productivity and quality. It allowed for the development of new technologies and techniques. It created a more diverse and resilient economy. But it also created new social dynamics. Specialists depended on others for things they no longer produced themselves. This interdependence required systems of exchange, ways of trading specialized goods and services. It required trust and cooperation. It required rules and norms that governed economic and social interactions. The specialization that developed during the Ubaid period was another crucial step toward civilization. It created the economic foundation that would support the complex urban societies that would emerge in Sumer. It demonstrated that humans could organize themselves in ways that were more than the sum of their parts, creating societies that were capable of achievements far beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. By 4000 BC, all the essential elements for civilization were in place in southern Mesopotamia. Agriculture was well established and productive, supported by sophisticated irrigation systems. Populations were large and growing. Social organization was complex, with formal leadership, specialized roles, and hierarchical structures. Trade networks connected distant regions. Temples served as centers of religious, economic, and administrative activity. Technology was advancing, with pottery, metalworking, and construction techniques becoming more sophisticated. But these were still villages and towns, not yet true cities. What distinguishes a city from a large village? Size matters, but it's not everything. A city is more than just a large settlement. It's a different kind of human organization. Cities have dense populations, but they also have complex social structures, specialized economic functions, and central institutions that serve a wider region. They are centers of innovation, culture, and power. They coordinate the activities of surrounding areas. They are places where new ideas are born, tested, and spread. The transition from large villages to true cities would happen around 4000 BC, marking the beginning of the Uruk period and the true emergence of Sumerian civilization. This transition would be rapid and dramatic. Within a few centuries, settlements would grow from towns of a few thousand to cities of tens of thousands. They would develop new forms of government, new technologies, new ways of organizing society. Most importantly, they would invent writing, the technology that would allow them to record their history, manage their complex economies, and create the first literature. The stage was set. All the pieces were in place. Civilization was about to begin. What makes a civilization? This is a question that scholars have debated for centuries, but most agree on certain essential characteristics. A civilization typically has cities, large, dense settlements that serve as centers of political, economic, and cultural activity. It has a complex social structure with different classes, specialized roles, and hierarchical organization. It has some form of government or political system that can coordinate large-scale activities and maintain order. It has economic specialization, with different people producing different goods and services, and systems for exchanging these. It has advanced technology relative to its time, not just tools, but complex systems like irrigation, architecture, and eventually, writing. It has cultural achievements, art, literature, religion, philosophy, that go beyond basic survival needs. It has the ability to record and transmit knowledge across generations. And it has influence beyond its immediate boundaries, affecting surrounding regions through trade, cultural exchange, or political power. By these criteria, the communities of southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BC were on the very threshold of civilization. They had most of these elements, but not yet in the fully developed form that would characterize Sumerian civilization. The next few centuries would see these elements come together in new and powerful ways, creating something unprecedented in human history, the world's first true civilization. The journey from the first agricultural villages to the threshold of civilization had taken over 3,000 years. The next phase, the emergence of Sumerian cities and the full flowering of civilization, would happen much more quickly, transforming human society in ways that would echo down through the millennia. We have journeyed from the dawn of agriculture, through the first permanent villages, past the development of irrigation and trade, to the threshold of civilization itself. We have seen how humans learn to control their environment, to organize themselves in new ways, to specialize and trade, to build temples and coordinate large-scale projects. All of this was preparation. All of this was the foundation. Now, the stage is set for the next great chapter in human history. Around 4000 BC, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something unprecedented was about to happen. The first true cities would emerge. Uruk, Eridu, Ur, and other great Sumerian cities would rise from the Mesopotamian plain, their populations swelling to tens of thousands. These cities would develop new forms of government, new technologies, new ways of organizing society. Most dramatically, they would invent writing, the technology that would allow humans to record their thoughts, their history, their laws, and their stories for the first time. This invention would mark the boundary between prehistory and history itself. In our next episode, we will witness the birth of these first cities, explore their streets and temples, meet their people, and discover how they transformed from large villages into the world's first urban civilizations. The story of Sumer, the world's first civilization, is about to begin. Join us as we step across the threshold into history itself. We've just scratched the surface of one of the greatest stories in human history. From the first farmers to the threshold of civilization, we've witnessed the foundation of everything that would follow. But this is only the beginning. In our next episode, we'll step into the world's first true cities. Uruk, with its massive ziggurat reaching toward the heavens. Eridu, the oldest city on Earth. We'll walk their streets, explore their temples, and meet the people who built them. We'll witness the moment when humans invented writing, the technology that would mark the boundary between prehistory and history itself. We'll discover how these first cities transformed human society forever, creating systems of government, law, and culture that would influence civilizations for thousands of years. This is a story you don't want to miss. If you found this episode fascinating, if you want to understand how civilization truly began, then make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss episode 2. Your support means everything to us. Like this video if you want to see more content about the empires that shook the world. Comment below and tell us, what surprised you most about the journey to civilization? What are you most excited to learn about in episode 2? And share this video with anyone who loves history, because this is a story that deserves to be told. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode, where the real story of Sumer begins. Until then, remember, every great civilization starts with a single step. Sumer took that step 5,000 years ago, and it changed the world forever.